At 8:20 on the morning of April 18, 1942, Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle stood on the forward end of USS Hornet, feeling the carrier shudder beneath his boots as green water smashed against the bow and washed back across the steel flight deck. He was 37 years old. He had never launched an aircraft from a carrier, and in front of him lay 467 feet of deck, wet, pitching, and narrowing toward the open Pacific. Beyond that edge waited nothing. 650 miles to the west, the Japanese home island sat untouched and confident for months after Pearl Harbor. Tokyo had not been bombed. Japan's population believed the war was distant, the emperor's cities unreachable. That belief was about to end. Doolittle's aircraft, a North American B-25B Mitchell, sat at the very front of the deck, its nose pointed into the wind, its wheels chalked inches from the bow. Fully loaded, the bomber weighed just over 31,000 pounds. Its twin Wright R-2600 engines would need 44 inches of manifold pressure simply to overcome inertia. Naval engineers had run the numbers months earlier at Norfolk. A B-25 required 3,600 feet of runway to reach flying speed under ideal conditions. Doolittle had 467. The mission existed only because of a moment of observation. In January, Captain Francis Lowe, a submarine officer serving on Admiral Ernest King's staff, had been visiting Norfolk Navy Yard. While walking the field, he noticed Army bombers practicing short takeoffs, white lines painted on the concrete to simulate a carrier deck. Lowe stopped and stared. If Army bombers could take off like this, and if carriers could get close enough to Japan, then maybe, just maybe, Tokyo could be reached. The problem was brutal. The B-25B cruised at 230 miles per hour. Its standard range was 1,300 miles. Tokyo sat 1,500 miles from any friendly airfield. Even if the bombers reached Japan, they could not return. Landing a medium bomber on a moving carrier was impossible. After bombing, the crews would have to continue west, across hostile territory, hoping to reach free China before fuel ran out. It was a one-way flight. Every aircraft option was tested on paper and rejected. The Douglas B-23, wingspan too wide. The Martin B-26, takeoff roll too long. Only one aircraft survived the mathematics. The B-25 Mitchell. On February 3rd, two B-25s were hoisted aboard Hornet at Norfolk. Both launched successfully. The idea worked, at least once. Training began in March at Eglin Field, Florida. Navy Lieutenant Henry Miller taught Army crews how to pull heavy bombers into the air using brakes, engine power, and wind instead of runway length. White lines painted on auxiliary fields marked 500-foot launch zones. Some pilots mastered it. Some aircraft did not survive the attempt. The crews who failed were quietly removed from the mission. No one was told where they were going. On April 1st, 16 modified B-25Bs were craned onto Hornet at Naval Air Station Alameda. Each aircraft carried 4 500-pound bombs, 3 high-explosive, 1 incendiary bundle. Lower gun turrets were removed to save weight. Extra fuel tanks filled the space, bringing total fuel capacity to 1,141 gallons. An additional 50 gallons rode in 5-gallon cans, lashed inside the fuselage. Task Force 16 sailed west on April 2nd. Hornet carried the bombers. Enterprise provided air cover. Cruisers Nashville and Vincennes formed the screen. Destroyers guarded the perimeter. The plan was to launch 400 miles from Japan on April 19th. The enemy intervened first. At dawn on April 18th, a Japanese picket boat, Nito Maru, spotted the task force. Before Nashville's 6-inch guns destroyed it, the vessel transmitted a contact report. Radio intercepts confirmed the worst. The message got through. Admiral William Halsey, commanding from Enterprise, understood immediately. The task force was now 650 miles from Tokyo, 200 miles farther than planned. Waiting risked losing 2 irreplaceable carriers to Japanese air or surface attack. At 7:40, Halsey sent the order. Launch planes. To Colonel Doolittle and Gallant Command, good luck and God bless you. Doolittle reached aircraft number 40 to 2,344 at 8 o'clock. His crew was already in place. Co-pilot Lieutenant Richard Cole checked fuel. Navigator Lieutenant Henry Potter verified headings. Bombardier Staff Sergeant Fred Bramer inspected the bomb bay. Engineer Staff Sergeant Paul Leonard monitored engine instruments. The deck pitched 15 degrees in heavy seas. Salt spray soaked the steel. A 40-knot headwind blew straight down the deck. Normally a gift, today a gamble. There was only one rule. Every bomber had to fly. If Doolittle failed, his aircraft would be shoved overboard so the others could launch. 15 bombers waited behind him, each with slightly more deck than the one before. As mission commander, Doolittle had chosen to go first with the shortest possible run. At 8:15, he climbed into the left seat. Hornet turned into the wind at full speed. At the bow, Navy Lieutenant Edgar Osborne watched the sea. His job was to release Doolittle at the exact moment the carrier rose on a swell, adding precious degrees of lift at the instant the wheels left the deck. Doolittle pushed both throttles forward. 44 inches of manifold pressure, 2,400 revolutions per minute. The brakes held as 1,700 horsepower per engine strained forward. At 8:20, Osborne dropped the checkered flag. Doolittle released the brakes. The B-25 surged forward across wet steel. 60 miles per hour. 70. The bow rushed closer. 80 miles per hour. Still 20 below flying speed. The aircraft rolled off the deck. For 3 seconds, bomber number 40 to 2,344 dropped toward the Pacific. Engines screamed. Propellers clawed at empty air. At 95 miles per hour, the wings bit. The Mitchell climbed. Doolittle banked left, circled once while Cole confirmed heading, then leveled out and turned west, dropping to wavetop altitude. Behind him, the second aircraft advanced, then the third, then the fourth. One by one, 16 Army bombers thundered down Hornet's deck and lifted into history. None fell into the sea. By 9:20, the flight deck was empty. Japan lay ahead. The 16 bombers reached Japan almost simultaneously, each approaching its assigned target from a different direction, spread across more than 100 miles of airspace. There was no formation, no mutual support, no second pass. Each aircraft was alone. Lieutenant Travis Hoover led a 3-plane element toward northern Tokyo. Captain David Jones brought his flight in over the central industrial districts. Captain Edward York aimed his aircraft at southern Tokyo. 3 bombers diverted toward Yokohama, 2 toward Nagoya, and 1 turned south for Kobe. At 12:35 p.m., air raid sirens began to wail across Tokyo. At first, no one reacted. The sirens were familiar, routine drills, practiced endlessly since the start of the war. Japanese civilians had been conditioned to treat them as exercises. No one believed American bombers could possibly reach the home islands. Pearl Harbor lay 4,500 miles east. The Philippines had fallen. Wake Island had fallen. Guam had fallen. Everywhere in the Pacific, American forces were retreating. The idea that twin-engine Army bombers were overhead was unthinkable. 3 minutes later, that illusion collapsed. At 12:38, Fred Bramer opened the bomb bay doors aboard Doolittle's aircraft. Cold air flooded the fuselage. Ahead lay the target, a steelworks complex, 3 factory buildings, rail sidings, storage tanks, an essential node in Japan's war production network. Bramer centered the Norden sight on the largest structure. At 12:40 p.m., he released all 4 bombs. The first high-explosive punched through the factory roof and detonated inside the building. The second and third struck adjacent structures. The fourth, the incendiary bundle, split open after release, scattering 48 individual firebombs across a 200-yard area. Within seconds, flames erupted across the complex. Doolittle threw the bomber into a hard left bank and dove for the deck. Japanese anti-aircraft batteries finally responded. Black bursts of flak blossomed above the city, late and inaccurate. None found the range. The B-25 was already gone, accelerating at maximum power, skimming away at 500 feet. Behind him, the other crews were already on their runs. Hoover arrived over northern Tokyo at 12:42. His bombardier released 4 bombs onto an oil tank farm. The tanks exploded in towering orange fireballs visible for miles. Captain Jones struck a power plant in central Tokyo, knocking out electricity across 6 city blocks. York's flight hit ammunition depots in the southern districts. Secondary explosions continued for nearly 20 minutes, detonating stored ordnance long after the bombers had departed. In Yokohama, Lieutenant Edgar McElroy's crew bombed the waterfront dockyards. In Nagoya, Lieutenant William Farrow hit an oil refinery and storage facility. In Kobe, Lieutenant Donald Smith attacked factories producing aircraft components. Every primary target was struck. In many cases, damage exceeded expectations. Japan's light industrial construction, wood, paper, thin steel, burned rapidly. Fires spread faster than Japanese civil defense units could respond. At 12:50 p.m., Japanese fighters scrambled from Kisarazu Airfield, 24 Mitsubishi A6M0s fitted with long-range tanks, followed by 29 medium bombers armed with torpedoes. The fighters climbed to 20,000 feet, searching for the attackers. They found nothing. The American bombers were already gone, scattered, flying solo at wave-top altitude across a vast front. The sky above Tokyo filled with flak and confusion, but no B-25 was intercepted. Not one American aircraft was lost over the target. By 1:15 p.m., all 16 bombers had cleared Japanese airspace and turned southwest along the coast. The strike was over. Now came the hardest part. At 1:30, Doolittle checked the fuel gauges. 700 gallons remaining. Navigator Henry Potter calculated the distance to the planned recovery airfields near Chuzhou, China, roughly 900 miles. Total flight time from Hornet would be about 13 hours. Fuel endurance was estimated at 14. On paper, they would make it, barely. But the plan depended on things beyond mathematics. Chinese forces were supposed to have prepared landing strips. Radio homing beacons were supposed to guide the bombers in. Ground crews were supposed to be waiting. At 2 p.m., Cole tried raising Chuzhou on the radio. No response. Potter switched to emergency frequencies. Silence. The beacons weren't transmitting, either never activated or never delivered. Whatever the reason, the carefully planned recovery had evaporated. Doolittle kept flying west. There was no alternative. Ironically, the same tailwind that had pushed them unexpectedly close to Japan now became their lifeline. A 25-mile-per-hour wind from the east increased ground speed and reduced fuel burn. Potter recalculated every 15 minutes. If the wind held, they would reach the Chinese coast with perhaps 30 minutes of fuel remaining. Weather deteriorated after 3 p.m. Clouds thickened. Visibility dropped below 2 miles. Rain squalls swept in from the sea. Flying at 200 feet over open ocean and worsening weather tested every pilot to the limit. No landmarks. No radio navigation. Only instruments and dead reckoning across 1,200 miles of water. At 4:30 p.m., trouble struck. Lieutenant Robert Gray's bomber developed engine problems. Oil pressure fluctuated. The right R-2600 ran rough. The crew discussed bailing out while still over water versus pressing on. Gray kept flying. 20 minutes later, the engine smoothed out, but the warning was clear. One failure would mean death in the ocean. At 6:40 p.m., land finally appeared through breaks in the clouds. Potter confirmed their position. After 9 hours of overwater flight, they were within 20 miles of their estimated landfall. Relief lasted only seconds. The landing fields should have been visible. They weren't. Fuel gauges now showed 150 gallons, less than 2 hours of flight time. Darkness would fall in 90 minutes. The radios remained silent. At 7 p.m., Doolittle made the decision. They would bail out while altitude and fuel allowed controlled flight. Flying until the engines quit would mean bailing out blind, at night, over unknown terrain. At 7:30, Doolittle climbed to 8,000 feet and set the autopilot. At 7:45, he gave the order. Bramer jumped first. Leonard followed. Potter went next. Cole after him. Doolittle went last. As he stepped into the darkness at 7:50 p.m., he glanced at the cockpit clock. Exactly 13 hours since leaving Hornet. The B-25 flew on alone, westward, until fuel exhaustion. All 5 of Doolittle's crew landed safely in China. He himself crashed through trees and hit hard in a flooded rice paddy, 70 miles north of Chuzhou. At dawn, Chinese farmers found him walking along a dirt road. They didn't share a language, but they recognized the uniform. Other crews were not as fortunate. Gray's aircraft lost 1 man. Corporal Leland Factor, 20 years old, killed when his parachute failed to deploy properly. Captain Edward York, unable to reach China, turned north and landed in the Soviet Union, where his crew was immediately interned. Lieutenant Ted Lawson's bomber ran out of fuel offshore. He attempted a controlled ditching in heavy seas. The aircraft broke apart on impact. The raid had succeeded. Now its cost was being paid. Lieutenant Ted Lawson's aircraft did not sink immediately. When the B-25 struck the water off the Chinese coast, the impact tore the fuselage open and crushed the nose. Fuel spilled across the waves. Wreckage floated briefly, then began to disappear beneath the surf. Lawson's left leg was shattered. Co-pilot Dean Davenport suffered severe internal injuries. Navigator Charles McClure was concussed. Bombardier Robert Clever had multiple broken ribs. Only one man could still move freely. David Thatcher, the rear gunner, 20 years old. Thatcher dragged his crewmates clear of the wreckage before the bomber sank. He pulled them through the surf, one by one, onto the beach. He scavenged wreckage to build a crude shelter. He collected rainwater in twisted metal panels and fabric. He kept watch through the night, listening for Japanese patrols, keeping the injured alive. For 2 days, Thatcher held the crew together. On the third day, Chinese guerrillas found them. The fighters carried the wounded Americans inland to a village hospital, little more than a collection of rooms with dirt floors and improvised beds. There, Lieutenant Thomas White, a physician who had volunteered for the mission and flown as a gunner on another aircraft, performed surgery with almost no equipment. He amputated Lawson's leg. The procedure saved his life. Elsewhere, fate was harsher. Lieutenant Dean Hallmark's bomber also ditched in the ocean. 2 crewmen drowned, trapped inside the sinking aircraft. 3 survived: Hallmark, Robert Meader, and Chase Nielsen. They reached shore and were captured almost immediately by Japanese forces. Captain William Farrow's crew bailed out over Japanese-occupied territory. All 5 were captured within days. 8 Americans were now prisoners of the Imperial Japanese Army. The remaining crews were scattered across hundreds of miles of Chinese territory. Some landed in areas controlled by nationalist forces. Others came down in contested zones where Chinese guerrillas and Japanese occupation troops fought daily. A few landed in remote mountains where no organized forces operated at all. Survival depended almost entirely on civilians. Chinese farmers, many of whom had never seen an American, hid the airmen in barns and caves. Villagers shared food despite their own hunger. Guerrilla fighters guided injured men through patrol areas at night. Catholic missionaries provided medical care, clothing, and translation. Helping the raiders carried a death sentence. They did it anyway. At a mission compound in Linchuan, Father Herbert Vandenberg, an American priest, received messages from nearby missions. Several raiders were being sheltered. The men arrived on foot, exhausted, malnourished, their clothing torn from climbing down mountains after bailout. The missionaries fed them fried chicken. Nuns washed and stitched their uniforms. Priests surrendered their beds. By April 23rd, 5 days after the raid, 64 of the 80 raiders had reached safety in free China. Doolittle and his crew arrived in Chongqing on April 25th. Others followed over the next week. Many had walked 50 to 200 miles through enemy territory with Chinese assistance. In Washington, those days passed in silence. No confirmed word had arrived. Japanese radio broadcasts claimed 9 American bombers had been shot down. The New York Times printed the statements. U.S. officials quietly prepared to distance themselves from what might prove a catastrophic failure. On April 28th, Doolittle's first report reached Army Air Force's headquarters. 71 raiders accounted for. 5 interned in the Soviet Union. 3 confirmed dead. 8 missing, presumed captured. All targets bombed successfully. No aircraft lost over Japan. The mission had succeeded. President Franklin Roosevelt announced the raid publicly on April 29th. When reporters asked where the bombers had launched from, Roosevelt smiled and said, "From Shangri-La." The joke became legend. Later that year, the Navy would name a new carrier USS Shangri-La. In Tokyo, there was no humor. The raid had exposed a fatal weakness. American carriers had approached within 600 miles. Army bombers had launched from them. Tokyo had been struck in daylight. The bombers had escaped. The homeland defense strategy had failed. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto accelerated plans for a decisive battle. He would force the American carriers into combat by attacking Midway Island. The Americans would have to respond. The Japanese fleet would destroy them. The Doolittle raid made Midway inevitable. In eastern China, a different response was already underway. On April 24th, the Imperial Japanese Army issued orders. 53 battalions would sweep through Zhejiang province. Officially, the goal was to eliminate airfields that could support future American attacks. Unofficially, it was punishment. The operation, later known as the Zhejiang Jiangxi Campaign, began in May. Japanese forces advanced from 3 directions. Airfields were destroyed, hangars burned, radios dismantled, then the villages, towns that had sheltered airmen were erased. Civilians were executed regardless of guilt. Wells were poisoned, crops burned, livestock slaughtered. By late June, biological warfare units entered the region. Pathogens, cholera, typhoid, plague, were released into water supplies. Disease spread through populations already devastated by violence and starvation. Conservative estimates later placed Chinese civilian deaths at 250,000. Some estimates went higher. Entire communities vanished without survivors to count the dead. In Shanghai, the 8 captured American raiders awaited judgment. Hallmark, Meter, Nielsen, Faro, Height, Bar, DeShazer, Spatz. The Japanese government passed a retroactive law declaring that enemy airmen who bombed civilian targets could be executed. Their trial began in October 1942. The raid had shaken an empire. The price was being paid by others. The trial lasted 2 days. No defense was permitted. No witnesses were called on behalf of the accused. No verdict was ever in doubt. On October 15, 1942, all 8 American airmen were found guilty. All 8 were sentenced to death. Under international law, the men were prisoners of war. The Geneva Convention specified their protection. The Japanese government rejected that interpretation. They declared the raiders criminals who had attacked civilian targets, placing them outside the protections of lawful combat. The distinction had no standing under international law. Execution would be illegal regardless of terminology. On October 19th, Japanese authorities announced that 5 sentences had been commuted to life imprisonment. No explanation was given. No criteria were provided. The decision appeared arbitrary. 3 names remained under sentence of death: Dean Hallmark, William Faro, Harold Spatz. They were transferred to Bridge House Prison in Shanghai, a facility notorious for abuse. The men were placed in solitary confinement. Food rations were minimal. Medical care was non-existent. Guards provided no information and no contact with the outside world. On October 15, 1942, exactly 6 months after the raid, guards removed the 3 men from their cells. They were driven to a cemetery outside Shanghai. At 3 p.m., a firing squad executed all 3. They were 25, 24, and 21 years old. They became the first American airmen executed by Japan during the war. The remaining prisoners, Meter, Height, Bar, Nielsen, and DeShazer, were transferred to a military prison near Nanking. Conditions there were worse. Food provided barely enough calories to sustain life. Winter cold when untreated. Disease spread unchecked. On December 1, 1943, Robert Meter died of malnutrition, beriberi, and dysentery. He was 27 years old. His body was buried in an unmarked grave. The 4 remaining prisoners endured 40 months in captivity. They would not be freed until August 1945. While they survived imprisonment, events in the Pacific were accelerating toward a decisive confrontation. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto moved forward with his plan to destroy the American carrier fleet. The humiliation of Tokyo demanded restoration of confidence. The objective was Midway Island. American codebreakers at Station HYPO intercepted Japanese naval communications in May. They identified Midway as the target. Admiral Chester Nimitz received confirmation on May 20th. The Japanese attack would begin on June 4th. Japan committed its most powerful naval force since Pearl Harbor: 4 fleet carriers, 2 battleships, 11 cruisers, and dozens of destroyers. Nimitz had 3 carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, Yorktown. Yorktown had been damaged at Coral Sea 2 weeks earlier. Shipyard estimates called for 3 months of repairs. Nimitz gave them 3 days. Welders worked continuously. Temporary patches replaced structural fixes. Yorktown sailed on May 30th. The strategic balance was precarious. Japan dominated the Pacific. The loss of the American carriers would end the war at sea. But Nimitz knew the time and place of the attack. At 4:30 a.m., On June 4th, Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu launched the first strike against Midway. 108 aircraft hit the island at dawn. Damage was inflicted, but the airfield remained operational. At 7 a.m., Japanese scouts reported American ships northeast of Midway. Admiral Chuchi Nagumo hesitated. His aircraft were armed for land attack. Rearming for naval strike would take time. At 7:15 a.m., he ordered the change. At 7:40 a.m., a corrected report confirmed the presence of an American carrier. The timing proved fatal. The Japanese decks filled with fueled aircraft, exposed ordnance, and unsecured torpedoes. The carriers were unable to launch or recover aircraft. At 9:20 a.m., American torpedo bombers attacked. They were annihilated. Squadron after squadron was destroyed. Torpedoes missed. Losses were catastrophic. But the attacks forced Japanese fighters to low altitude. At 10:22 a.m., American dive bombers arrived from high altitude. They found the carriers helpless. Within 5 minutes, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were burning beyond control. Later that afternoon, Hiryu launched a counterstrike that crippled Yorktown, but American dive bombers located Hiryu before sunset. Four bomb hits sealed her fate. She sank the following morning. By June 5th, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers were gone. Japan lost 248 aircraft and 3,000 sailors. The core of its naval air power was destroyed. The battle continued briefly, but the outcome was irreversible. From Midway forward, Japan would fight a defensive war. The chain of events was direct. From Hornet's deck to Tokyo. From Tokyo to Midway. From Midway to the collapse of Japanese naval supremacy. The raid had lasted minutes. Its consequences reshaped the war. The raid on Tokyo achieved little in physical destruction. Its true effect was psychological. Japanese leadership had believed the home islands were beyond reach. The attack shattered that assumption. Carrier-based aircraft had brought American bombs to the capital less than 4 months after Pearl Harbor. The vulnerability was undeniable. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto demanded a decisive response. The American carriers had to be destroyed. He selected Midway Island as the point of engagement. The operation would force the U.S. Navy into battle under conditions favorable to Japan. American intelligence intercepted the plan. Admiral Chester Nimitz prepared an ambush. The result was the Battle of Midway, the most consequential naval engagement of the Pacific War. Back in the United States, Jimmy Doolittle received word of Midway in mid-June 1942. By then, he had already been promoted to brigadier general. The raid had been officially judged a success despite the loss of all 16 aircraft. The broader consequences were now clear. On May 19, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt presented Doolittle with the Medal of Honor at the White House. The citation recognized extraordinary heroism in planning and leading an unprecedented strike against the Japanese homeland. Doolittle became the first reserve officer to receive the Medal of Honor during World War II. He was promoted 2 ranks at once, from lieutenant colonel directly to brigadier general. Every participant in the raid received the Distinguished Flying Cross. Awards for those killed or captured were issued posthumously or while they remained in enemy hands. The citations were classified. The mission's full details remained secret until the war ended. Publicly, officials confirmed only that American bombers had struck Japan. The Navy neither confirmed nor denied carrier involvement. Roosevelt's remark that the planes had come from Shangri-La became the official explanation. The raid validated a concept military planners had dismissed as impossible. Army bombers could operate from Navy carriers under carefully controlled conditions. The success accelerated interest in joint operations between services. Inter-service cooperation gained legitimacy. The raid demonstrated that innovation, preparation, and audacity could overcome limitations of doctrine and equipment. Task Force 16 returned to Pearl Harbor on April 25. Admiral William Halsey received the Navy Cross for his command of the operation. Captain Mark Mitcher, commanding officer of Hornet, was promoted to Rear Admiral within 6 months. Both men were now identified as aggressive leaders willing to accept calculated risk. Their careers would reflect that reputation for the remainder of the war. Doolittle himself expected punishment. All 16 aircraft had been lost. The original plan had called for recovery in China. From a strictly operational standpoint, the mission appeared to have failed. Doolittle later wrote that he assumed he would be demoted or court-martialed. General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the Army Air Forces, disagreed. 16 B-25s were insignificant compared to American production capacity. The strategic and psychological effects outweighed the losses by orders of magnitude. Arnold told Doolittle the raid was the most important air operation of the war to that point. The promotion and Medal of Honor followed. The raid also influenced future carrier operations. While B-25s never became standard carrier aircraft, the Navy recognized that land-based bombers could deliver capabilities carrier aircraft could not: longer range, heavier payloads, and flexibility for special missions. More importantly, the raid reinforced the value of surprise and audacity. Traditional planning would never have approved launching medium bombers from a carrier deck only 467 feet long. The numbers said it could not work. Doolittle proved that preparation and skill could defeat arithmetic. That lesson endured. In China, the cost of the raid continued long after the airmen had escaped. The Japanese retaliation campaign across Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces lasted until August. Approximately 250,000 Chinese civilians were killed. Villages were erased. Churches, hospitals, and schools were destroyed. Missionaries who had aided the raiders lost everything. Some lost their lives. Chinese leadership never questioned the decision to help. General Chiang Kai-shek sent a message to Roosevelt acknowledging the scale of the losses. He emphasized that the raid had been worth the price. The demonstration that Japan could be attacked directly carried immense strategic value for China's war effort. Doolittle remained in active service for the duration of the war. He commanded the 12th Air Force in North Africa, the 15th Air Force in Italy, and later the 8th Air Force in England. He helped direct the strategic bombing campaign against Germany. He retired in 1946 as a lieutenant general. Of the 80 raiders, 71 survived the war. 9 died as a result of the mission or subsequent combat. 3 in crashes or bailouts. 3 executed by Japan. 1 in captivity. 1 in North Africa. 1 in a later operation. The 4 imprisoned raiders were liberated in August 1945. Beginning in 1946, the raiders held annual reunions. They commissioned 80 silver goblets, 1 for each participant. Each goblet bore a name. At every reunion, surviving members drank a toast. When a raider died, his goblet was turned upside down. The tradition continued for over 70 years. The final reunion occurred in November 2013 at the National Museum of the United States Air Force. Only 4 raiders remained alive. They shared the final toast using a bottle of cognac saved since 1946. Richard Cole, Doolittle's co-pilot, was the last survivor. He died in 2019 at age 103. Today, the goblets remain on display. Most are inverted. A restored B-25B Mitchell stands nearby, positioned on a replica of Hornet's flight deck. Visitors can stand where Doolittle stood. 467 feet to the edge. The raid entered American memory as an act of calculated audacity. Hollywood immortalized it in 30 seconds over Tokyo. The film reached millions. The story became legend. Materially, the raid changed little in Japan's industrial output. Psychologically, it changed everything. Japan diverted resources to homeland defense. Fighters stayed in Japan instead of deploying forward. Strategic priorities shifted. The loss of 4 carriers at Midway ensured Japan would never regain the initiative. The bombs did little damage. The consequences reshaped the war. From June 4, 1942 onward, the character of the Pacific War changed. Japan fought defensively. The Tokyo raid made Midway possible. Midway made American victory inevitable. In China, remembrance came slowly. For decades after the war, the story of the Doolittle raiders lived mostly in American memory. But over time, Chinese communities began to publicly commemorate what had happened in the spring of 1942 and the price that had been paid. In 2002, the city of Dianshan in Zhejiang province opened a memorial hall dedicated to the raid. The exhibit honors not only the 80 American airmen, but also the Chinese civilians who sheltered them. Photographs of the raiders line the walls. Beneath them are plaques listing the names of Chinese villagers who provided food, shelter, medical care, and guidance. The exhibit explains, plainly and without embellishment, that approximately 250,000 Chinese civilians died, because they chose to help 80 Americans escape. The memorial does not soften that truth. The hospital in Jiangshan, where Dr. Thomas White amputated Ted Lawson's leg with improvised tools, has been restored to its 1942 condition. The building now stands as a permanent memorial. The room where Lawson recovered is preserved exactly as it was. Descendants of the Chinese doctor who assisted in the surgery maintain the site. They guide visitors through the rooms and tell the story as it happened, without heroics, without apology. In 2015, during a state visit to the United States, Chinese President Xi Jinping publicly praised the Doolittle Raiders. He invited the last surviving raiders, Richard Cole and David Thatcher, to attend ceremonies in Beijing marking the 70th anniversary of the war's end. Both men accepted. They were honored as allies who had come to China's aid at a moment when the outcome of the war was still uncertain. The raid proved something that military planners rarely like to admit. Innovation and determination can overcome limits that appear absolute. The B-25 Mitchell was never designed to operate from aircraft carriers. The mathematics of takeoff distance, fuel consumption, and recovery options said the mission could not work. Every calculation pointed toward failure. Doolittle and his crews flew anyway. 16 bombers launched from a carrier deck with less than 500 feet of runway. Every aircraft became airborne. Every crew struck its target. 71 of 80 men survived. All 16 aircraft were lost, yet every tactical objective was achieved. The strategic consequences reshaped the Pacific War. If this story mattered to you, take a moment and hit the like button. Each like tells YouTube to keep stories like this alive. Subscribe if you haven't already. We're recovering forgotten history, stories of pilots, mechanics, sailors, and civilians who did the impossible when it mattered most. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Tell us if someone in your family served. You're not just watching history, you're helping preserve it. Jimmy Doolittle and his 80 raiders took off when everyone said it couldn't be done. They struck Tokyo when Japan believed the home islands were untouchable. They changed the war when America needed hope most. They deserve to be remembered, and by being here, you're making sure they are.